All right. So I think that both teams give a much larger discussion about capitalism versus speciesism as the root cause, because both sides say that it's a root cause, but neither side gives analysis over why one would be the root cause of the other, right? How did the exploitation of animals give rise to an industry of capitalism that allowed for the monetization of bodies? There's the assertion that it does, there's a pointing to the evidence, but there's not like examples of where this has taken place. And on the flip side, you're saying capitalism is the cause of animals. You say that far less than they say because they're doing more framing in terms of the root cause, but you do say it a couple of times. But again, how does capitalism give rise to the machine-like factory farm industry that allows for animal exploitation that exists? In cross-examination, when they say something like, well, how does animal prostitution, how do animals have prostitution? I mean, the entire dairy industry is an institution that's based upon sexually exploiting cows in order to be able to get the milk, in order to be able to utilize it, that in no way is consensual by the cows, that, you know, is not counted in forms of prostitution. And I would suggest both sides to look in the Carol Adams, The Sexual Politics of Meat and the Pornography of Meat. In there you'll find evidence that talks about the focus on gender and the way women's bodies are exploited is the best way to talk about the way that animal oppression has formed.
What's it called?
Carol Adams, The Sexual Politics of Meat, and she writes another book, The Pornography of Meat. And in there you can also find evidence about the way that animal oppression has structured the exploitation of women. So both books have arguments that could go either way based upon how you want to interpret and spin it, but the end point is that both are necessarily integral to take it into consideration. And it compares very much about the way the meat industry was used about creating women's bodies as like the rump, the breast, and like you go into butcher shops and there used to be women's bodies up there with different parts of the body segmented off to be consumed and killed. And so the linking of women's bodies as exploitable for consumption sexually is very much linked to the way that the meat industry is constructed as well. And so that sort of analysis could, on either side, you know, depending on how you want to spin that analysis, could be gender is essential to understanding the way that animal exploitation is structured, or animal exploitation is essential to understanding the way that gender is constructed.
I have a question. The second one you said, the pornography of meat, what was the first book?
The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Sexual politics. Okay.
And did you have a question?
I was just wondering, did you hear like, I might just miss it, but I didn't really hear like capitalism is like the root cause of like that oppression happening until like the 2AR explanation. Am I correct in that?
Well, I mean, they extend capitalism as the cause of all the bad things, right?
Like
everything
the
bad.
cause of prostitution.
Right, like they don't necessarily, no, but like it causes all death and extermination and exploitation,
Okay.
right? The way that they tag their evidence makes those claims. Like they don't use the word root cause in the 2AC1AR, but they're making it's the cause of all these bad things that they rattle off a listing for. So it's not like they've entirely conceded the root cause debate. They've just sort of not used the term root cause, but have said elsewhere in the debate, capitalism results in environmental destruction, extinction, and exploitation, right? And so that means that you should do the work there and sort of always assume the best version of the opponent's argument. Assume that they made their capitalism as a root cause claim, right? Because 9 out of 10 times they will, and answer it. And so if you think they don't, be like, they don't make the root cause claim. Even if they did, we control the root cause because, and then warrant an explanation for it. And you explain you're the root cause. You just don't really give great warrants for why it props up capitalism specifically, right? You talk about domination in general, but their app is capitalism, right? So make the capitalism or the gendered arguments, not just exploitation holistically, right? And that'll bring that analysis to the next level. And the same thing for you. If they're talking about speciesism, don't just talk about capitalism causes death and stuff like that. Explain like how it then turns like food into a mechanized process that gave rise to factory farms, and then it's going to be able to have deeper, better analysis in regards to that, right? And so that's how you can bring, again, sort of the analysis to the next level. In the end, I end up voting negative. I could vote on just like, they say it in both the 2NC and the 2NR, the permutation severs the original 1IC's focus, and there's not a response in the 1AR to the 2AR to that, and there's enough time there where I could pull the trigger on that. But I think beyond that, your attempt to just say that we are linking out because we aren't silencing the oppression. There's nothing that we do that directly undermines the ability to focus on animals isn't true given the link work that's done on the negative side, because that's one of the things that they do spend more time exploring the links on, that like the way that you focus on dehumanization, the way that you focus on trying to help one certain population, i.e. women as a population, and people who are in prostitution or trafficking is a point of where it puts certain animals above other animals, whether in terms of the focus that takes place, which is their Kim evidence, and then also the way in which they point out also that the state is also then linked up in these processes. So there's at least 3 links that are explained that you engage in, which is like using the state to focus on the way that you put the emphasis on humans through dehumanization, and then targeting a specific human group. So it's not even like all humans. It's like, women who are prostituted. Specifically, and so like you do have evidence in the 1AC that says the focus on women is essential in order to have other focuses, but even with that, it still is not a focus on sort of the non-human animal. So when the majority of your link story is structured around we don't silence it, but there's links saying that explaining how it applies, then it's hard for you to win those sort of arguments. You need to I think that having offense on it's important. And so you need to have some arguments, not just about how you could solve the arguments that you could solve the criticism if you're going to go the permutation route. Like, not just human rights are good, right? Human rights is good is a link for them because then you're focusing on the need for human rights. If you had a card that said human rights will enable animal rights, paying attention to women will be able to help other species, it solves the divide. Those are the types of evidence that shows how you solve for it. I do commend you on recognizing that you were reading an impact card for capitalism in the 2AC and then scratching that card. So you at least had that down. And there is evidence that indicates that human rights are essential to producing change. So it's for non-humans as well. So that evidence does exist, and you can go that route. But you should also have arguments about like the why. Like there's evidence against standpoint of the animal because it assumes that we can know what other non-humans are like and put ourselves in the role of a dog or a chicken, or just recognizing that we're also animals is not necessarily the standpoint of every animal. So the standpoint of what animal it could be questioned. And so there's a lot that's on standpoint theory in general, because standpoint theory actually came out of like feminist thought and the way that we could view different forms of oppression. So there were people who were criticizing standpoint theory prior to their author's usage of it within the world of the animal. So you can find people who respond both to best version of standpoint theory and standpoint theory more generically. And so I would say that's worth doing because it is a relatively common alternative. And I think you do a pretty good job of explaining the alternative throughout the debate, especially in the cross-examination. Be like, of course I can do it, I'm an animal, right? And that makes it clear that you are, that's what you're getting, that's how you disrupt it.
Okay.
I think that you could use that as a link more explicitly in the actual debate by saying like, their attempt to say that I can't be an animal is another proof of how they recreate that divide, right? So you should bring those sort of things from cross-examination into the debate, and that would help, advance it to the next level. So that'd be what I'd say. 1 hour, don't take prep for the 1 hour. You're just giving them free prep time, so don't do that. I think that you do, a fine job on the case debate, except for right at the start of the case debate, in that you say that dehumanization isn't the biggest impact. Instead, the devaluation of human life by capitalism is the biggest impact. We'll prove that they reinform capitalism, right? So that's, at that moment, you've said the biggest impact is not anything that 2NC said. Right. And so if the 1AR is like, we agree with the 1AR, we both now agree that human exploitation through capitalism is the biggest impact. To concede that argument, that gets leveraged against the entirety of the criticism. So you really need to watch out for, because that 1NR, like 5 seconds, could be a round loser in relation to speciesism, and then the 2NC is useless, and the only thing the 2NR could go for is your case arguments. Which it's not that you did a bad job on the case arguments, but you don't want to be like, yeah, because you specifically said human devaluation through capitalism is the biggest impact, and I get why you're saying that, but you should be like, the biggest impact is the devaluation of all life, and we'll show how they specifically increase capitalism. You never want to make their impact the biggest in the round. If you ever critique that something else, because you're almost spotting them in that case debate, that capitalism is at fault for everything.
But I didn't do it.
Yeah. So more explicitly be like, we'll win that. Speciesism is the biggest focus and the biggest impact in the round. Even if you don't buy that, we're winning within their paradigm because, right? And that's a better sequencing of events. And then lastly, if you're going to have a permutation, you should have a net benefit to the permutation. Why is it good to do both things simultaneously? And those Carol Adam books, as well as other things, if you just like Google like feminism and animal rights,
We can find that card. We
did
we'll
have
talk
one
about.
card in the species.
We
Oh,
had
yeah?
it, but we just couldn't find
We were
it.
looking through it for it, and there wasn't.
So we're gonna, I'll go through those.
Like
books.
speciesism, ableism, race arguments, and speciesism and cap. Those are like the 4 critiques that you need to have answers for at all
We
times.
have all of them, but like they hid them. I just hid them.
Okay. Okay. You should know before you go into tomorrow's round, find those 4 blocks, because especially at tournament number 1, those are the 4 big generic go-to Ks right now. It's like
And then
race,
we knew
ableism,
about the whole
speciesism.
prostituting, how we're animals prostituting kind of question. I was legitimately confused
Mhm.
at that, but thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, I mean, there's whole rings of
Yeah.
animal prostitution that exist too, like where they actually do the same things that happen to trafficked women to animals, and it's as atrocious, but as with animals that, you know, have even different understandings of those sort of relationships.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch that goes on with that. And like, so something you know, something that's interesting is through your Nordic perspective, when bestiality happens, the human is prosecuted because it's illegal, the demand side, it's illegal, but that animal is generally executed. Because that animal also broke the law, even though that animal had no choice in breaking that law. And so animals that engage in bestial acts are oftentimes put down and euthanized, and then people who put them in those conditions are then prosecuted, right? So that's a good example, I think, for your Nordic approach for why ending demand while legalizing the sale is important, so that way those animals who are in those bestiality situations, same way the women who are in the trafficking situations, who don't have choices, aren't criminalized for these acts, but the people who are demanding are criminalized for the
So
acts.
should we create like a whole another like include that in our plain text of like with?
I mean, only if you want to have like speciesism in your 1AC. You don't need to do, but that could be an argument in the 2AC for how your Nordic approach through attacking speciesism, a reason for why your approach is essential. That's like a net benefit to the perm that it could
Could
be.
that just be sort of analytic, or would we have to have a specific?
You could always make analytical arguments, but it doesn't hurt to have evidence.
Okay.
So, you know.
I'll write this down.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, any other questions, or?
Is there anything else I could have like explained better, like on the speciesism debate?
I think your 2NC could have been slower with more analysis and less
Okay.
cards.
All right.
Like, even with 2 minutes extra, and it was really just like a bunch of cards that
Yeah.
weren't necessary because they repeated a lot of the 1NC's points, so it was sort of a boring speech for
Yeah.
that reason. So getting into the analysis, just slowing down, coming up with examples would have made it,
I'm sure
would
Okay.
have made it better. Right, there was like 3-4 arguments. You don't need to, you know, what you did was excess and didn't
Yeah.
necessarily advance your arguments any further.
Okay.
So,
So I did fine on the alternative debate.
yeah, the alternative and the link level debate is where you did good.
Okay.
The interacting the impact level is where you need work.
Okay.
How about the Dillon 99 with that, well, as we say, like the slavery is the largest impact, but that doesn't
That's their link. Dehumanization.
dehumanization.
Right, it's bad to not be a human because you're not treated like a human. Begs the question of why is being
I
a
missed
human not
that.
bad? They don't use that exact language, but like they do
Yeah.
talk about how dehumanization, the focus on humans, is what causes that divide, right? And you think about why is dehumanization bad? It's
What I don't
because
understand is,
it's an
like,
assumption
we're
that
talking
being
about prostitutes for women and children, so like I was thinking that like we're isolating just one problem out of many. So those problems, I'm sure they exist and happen, but like how are we, you know what I mean?
Well, your approach is let's not treat them like animals. Let's not dehumanize them, right? But what's wrong with being treated like an animal? What's wrong with being treated like an animal is that we treat animals wrong.
Okay.
Right, if we don't treat
I'm
animals
still
wrong,
trying to
right,
solve-
so that's the arguments for like why speciesism solves, is because if we don't treat our animals wrong, being dehumanized or being treated like an animal isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like think about some relationships that people have with their companion animals. They're not bad, right? They're very healthy, intimate, great relationships. And so being treated like those animals isn't necessarily a bad thing always. Well,
So
sometimes.
how can we like change the phrasing, so we should say like the like I guess like the actual like occurrence of what goes on in sexual trafficking is like not necessarily, like when we say dehumanization, I understand what you mean, so should we go like in depth with?
Well, the thing is, your evidence uses that language. So
So
you're
you
just
have
gonna
to-
have to defend that language or find new evidence, right? And that's, either way is fine. And like, you could be like, yeah, dehumanization is bad because the way these women are treated are just like the way these animals are treated. Until we learn to not treat women like this, we're never gonna not treat animals like that, right? The thought that we could stop raping cows for milk before we could stop raping human women is, right, what trafficker is going to be like, well, maybe I'll give up dairy because of speciesism before, if they're willing to go to those other acts and every sort of thing, right? So there is evidence out there that says, it comes from social ecology, that care for social inequalities and social justice has to come before cares for animals, because we can only have that deeper appreciation for the non-human world once we have an appreciation for humans. Otherwise, we're always going to view people as negatively.
Okay.
And so like that's social ecology, I think, is like Murray Bookchin and I think Zimmerman writes a little bit of it as well.
You read a lot on this.
So
Yeah.
it is a little bit of my area, but I've also done a bunch of work within, I have my concentration was also in gendered studies, so I've done a bunch of work on that regards as well.
Did you finish your PhD
Mhm.
in that? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So.
Mhm.
How did
Thank you.
you evaluate, how did you evaluate the legal liberalism arguments? Did that have any weight at all?
I didn't have to.
Arguing.
I didn't have to evaluate it. I think that, I mean, your reading good evidence indicates that it gets co-opted. Their reading evidence that the way the Nordic system works is distinctly different than the way you, that you phrase it. So like, you know, I'd have to go and compare that evidence if I was evaluating it. I think you did a good enough job to be able to win that argument. I think they did a good enough job not to being able to lose a priori on that argument.
Yeah.
So that argument really needs to be teamed up with some other offense. But I don't have to evaluate it if species and just solves the case and they link to species.
Cool.
What's, oh, sorry.
You got it.
I have to give like my coach like round thing. So what's the name of your team?
Liberty CW.
Liberty C. Thank you so much.
Just real quick, so, were there anything that could have optimized speeds at all? Like anything particularly irritating?
Very particularly not used proper for the 1 NR. Very particularly not contradict the entirety of the 2 NC at the opening of the 1 NR. Those two, right? Doing things in the 1 NR that could lose you the round, the worst thing for the 1 NR. The second worst thing is giving the 1 AR free proper time to answer all of the 2 AC arguments, or the 2 NC's arguments. So those are the two big things. The specifics of your line-by-line execution, impacting arguments, and all that sort of stuff is fine. You know, and I think you do good analysis on them, and I think you collapse it further and everything like that, which is fine. If you wanted a little bit more time pressure, I think you probably have enough time to at least shadow extend the counterplan and make them deal with it a little bit. And if there's no conditionality arguments in the round, it's sweet selling for the 2 NR to say we're not advocating goes away next. Right, so if there was conditionality, I would say kick out of it. No conditionality, it's like, why not take the extra 30 seconds that you spent repeating some of your points, extending the counter plan, especially when their offense was, perm, which obviously you can't legalize and decrim at the same time. And then second, like, decrim is bad, and theoretically you're ready for that debate. You read 2 pieces of evidence next page. So that would have been a real easy 1 NR. Yep.
For human rights, the answer they're like human rights is like bad because it's like focusing on the human. Is that what they're saying basically?
Right. Humans deserve rights.
Yeah. So how would you answer something like human rights is good? Would you say that or?
Yeah, but why?
Okay.
Right, like you have to justify why should we care about humans and why caring about humans should come first in this round. Right, which, intuitively people care about humans. Intuitively people think that humans come first, but you have to actually defend those points, right? And like at the point that humans consume more resources and do more destruction to the environment and do all this oppression, why are those humans' lives more valuable to these other animals? If we have the standpoint of the animal and we recognize how we're all the same, maybe we'll stop destroying the environment, maybe we'll stop exploiting each other and things like that. So you need to frame how having this ethical human lens will be able to solve for wider forms of injustice. And that evidence exists within the social ecology literature base.
Okay.
Alright, so like if you just...
Could you run that argument, but at the same time, defend like how the Nordic model helps animals as well?
Oh yeah, because the social ecology says that the only way that we'll help animals is by helping humans. We have to care about our social environments before we can care about the other species, because if we don't care about each other first, we're never going to care about everyone else either.
Okay.
So,
Thank you for all your
thank you.
help.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
Thank you. Helps out a lot.